The bills sat untouched on the table. 3 men in tailored suits leaned back in their chairs, arms crossed, smirking at the young waitress whose hands trembled around the check she held. Holly's voice cracked as she explained the policy, but their laughter drowned her words. Around them, the diner went quiet. Forks stopped mid-air. Conversations died. Everyone watched as the men declared they wouldn't pay a cent for service they deemed beneath them. No one moved to help. No one dared. But behind Holly, a figure emerged from the kitchen doorway. Gordon Walsh didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. What happened next would force those 3 men to confront something they'd spent their whole lives running from, and it would remind everyone in that diner why sometimes the quietest voices carry the heaviest truth. The morning had started like any other at Walsh's diner. Gordon had unlocked the front door at 5:30, the way he had every morning for the past 15 years. The neon sign flickered to life, casting a warm glow onto the empty street outside. Inside, the smell of fresh coffee and frying bacon filled the air. Gordon moved through the kitchen with practiced efficiency, his hands working the griddle while his mind wandered to the same place it always did, to the hospital room 8 years ago. To the moment the doctor had placed his newborn son into his arms and told him his wife wouldn't be coming home. To the choice he'd made that day to walk away from his position as head chef at the finest restaurant in the city and build something smaller, something he could manage alone. Devon sat at the corner booth now, his school books spread across the red vinyl seat. The boy's dark hair fell across his forehead as he bent over his math homework, his pencil moving slowly across the page. He was 8 years old, small for his age, with his mother's gentle eyes and Gordon's stubborn jaw. Every morning before school, father and son shared this quiet time together. Gordon would cook breakfast while Devon studied, and they would talk about everything and nothing. It was their ritual, their anchor in a world that had tried so hard to pull them under. Gordon glanced at his son through the serving window and felt the familiar tightness in his chest. Everything he did, every choice he made, was for that boy. Holly arrived at 6, her coat damp from the morning drizzle. She was 24, with tired eyes that made her look older and a smile that made her look younger. She'd been working at the diner for exactly 2 weeks, and Gordon could see the exhaustion wearing on her. Single mother of a 3-year-old boy, working 2 jobs to keep a roof over their heads. He'd hired her on the spot when she'd walked in with her resume, not because her experience was impressive, but because he recognized the desperation in her voice. He'd worn that same desperation once. He'd stood in kitchens just like his own, begging for a chance while people looked through him as if he didn't exist. A single father with a baby strapped to his chest, asking for any work they'd give him. Most had turned him away. One person hadn't. That was the only reason Gordon was still standing. The breakfast rush came and went without incident. The regulars filed in, faces Gordon knew better than his own reflection. Old Frank, who'd been coming in for coffee and toast every morning for 12 years. The Henderson twins, who worked construction and always left their table spotless. Mrs. Chen, who ordered the same omelet and told the same stories about her grandchildren. These were his people, his community. They'd watched Devon grow from a baby in a carrier to the boy doing homework in the corner booth. They'd brought casseroles when Gordon was too tired to cook at home. They'd offered babysitting, hand-me-down clothes, words of encouragement when the weight of single parenthood threatened to crush him. Walsh's diner wasn't just a restaurant, it was proof that kindness still existed in the world. Holly moved between tables with careful efficiency, her notepad clutched in one hand, her smile bright despite the shadows under her eyes. Gordon watched her interact with customers, saw how she remembered their orders, how she asked about their families. She was good at this work, better than she probably realized. But he could also see the fear that lived behind her eyes, the fear of making mistakes, of losing this job, of not being enough. He recognized it because he'd lived it. Every day for those first few years after his wife died, he'd woken up terrified. Terrified of failing his son, of making the wrong choice, of proving right all the people who'd told him a man couldn't raise a child alone. But he'd learned something important during those dark years. Fear didn't make you weak. What you did with that fear, that's what mattered. The lunch crowd began trickling in around 11:30. Gordon prepped orders in the kitchen while Devon had moved to the back room, working on his reading assignment. The boy had learned early how to be quiet, how to entertain himself, how to exist in the margins of his father's workday. It wasn't the childhood Gordon had wanted for him, but it was the one they had. And somehow, against all odds, Devon was thriving. He was kind, curious, resilient. He didn't complain about the long hours at the diner or the fact that they lived in a tiny apartment above the restaurant. He seemed to understand, in the way children sometimes do, that his father was doing the best he could. That understanding, that quiet acceptance, broke Gordon's heart and put it back together every single day. At 12:15, the door opened, and 3 men walked in. Gordon didn't see them at first, focused as he was on flipping burgers and monitoring the fryer. But he felt the shift in the atmosphere, the way the diner seemed to hold its breath. He looked up through the serving window and saw them standing in the entrance, scanning the room with the casual entitlement of people who'd never been told no. They wore suits that probably cost more than Gordon made in a month, watches that gleamed under the fluorescent lights. Their hair was perfectly styled, their shoes spotless. They looked wildly out of place in this working-class diner, and they knew it. Worse, they seemed to enjoy it. Holly approached them with her notepad and her practiced smile. Gordon saw her gesture toward an empty booth near the window, saw the men exchange glances before following her. Something about their body language set off warning bells in his mind. The way they walked, shoulders back, chins up, as if they owned the space they moved through. The way they looked at Holly, their eyes sliding over her uniform, dismissing her before she'd even spoken. Gordon had dealt with difficult customers before. Every restaurant worker had. But these men felt different. They felt dangerous in a way that had nothing to do with physical threat, and everything to do with the casual cruelty that came with unchecked power. The men settled into their booth, and Gordon watched through the window as Holly took their order. He couldn't hear the conversation, but he could read the body language, the way one of them kept changing his mind, making her cross things out and rewrite them, the way another interrupted her mid-sentence, his hand waving dismissively. The way the third simply stared at his phone, not bothering to look up when he spoke. Holly's smile never wavered, but Gordon saw the tension in her shoulders, the way her hand gripped the pencil a little too tight. He felt a protective anger rise in his chest, but he pushed it down. She was handling it. She didn't need him to interfere. Not yet. The order came back to the kitchen, and Gordon studied it with growing irritation. Steak, cooked medium rare but not too rare, with extra seasoning but not too much salt. Fries, crispy but not burnt, with ketchup on the side but also some on the plate. A salad with dressing, but the dressing in a separate bowl. And could they have extra croutons, but not too many? It was the kind of order designed to test, to establish dominance, to remind the staff that the customer was in control. Gordon had seen it 1,000 times before, usually from people who'd never worked a day in food service, who had no idea what it was like to stand over a hot grill for hours, trying to get everything perfect while orders piled up and the tickets kept coming. He cooked their food with the same care he gave every order. The steak was perfect, seared on the outside, tender and juicy on the inside, seasoned exactly right. The fries were golden, crispy, salted just enough. The salad was fresh, the vegetables crisp, the dressing measured precisely. Gordon plated everything with the skill that had once made him one of the most sought-after chefs in the city. He might have given up the prestige and the money, but he'd never given up his standards. Every plate that left his kitchen was a reflection of his pride, his dedication, his refusal to let circumstances diminish his craft. If these men wanted to judge him, they'd have nothing to criticize about the food. Holly carried the plates out, and Gordon watched through the window as she set them down. The men barely glanced at the food before one of them called her back. Gordon saw her lean in to listen, saw the man point at his steak, his face twisted in exaggerated displeasure. Holly nodded, picked up the plate, brought it back to the kitchen. She wouldn't meet Gordon's eyes as she explained that the steak wasn't cooked enough, that the customer wanted it redone. Gordon looked at the steak. It was exactly medium rare, exactly what had been ordered. But he didn't argue. He simply cooked another one, this time closer to medium, and sent it back out. He'd been in this industry long enough to know that some battles weren't worth fighting. 20 minutes later, it happened again. The fries were too salty. The salad dressing was wrong. The water wasn't cold enough. Each time, Holly made the trip back to the kitchen, her smile growing more strained, her hands shaking just a little more. Each time, Gordon fixed the problem, biting back his frustration. The other customers were starting to notice now, their conversations pausing as Holly rushed back and forth. Old Frank caught Gordon's eye through the window and shook his head slowly. His weathered face creased with concern. The Henderson twins stopped eating to watch. Mrs. Chen set down her fork, her mouth pressed into a thin line. The entire diner could feel the tension building, like a storm gathering on the horizon. In the back room, Devon had abandoned his reading assignment. The boy stood in the doorway between the kitchen and the dining area, his young face troubled. He'd grown up in this diner, had learned early to read the moods and rhythms of the space. He knew when something was wrong. Gordon caught his son's eye and gave him what he hoped was a reassuring nod, but Devon didn't move from the doorway. The boy's hands were clenched into small fists at his sides, and Gordon recognized the posture. It was the same way Devon stood when kids at school made fun of him for not having a mother. When they asked why his dad smelled like grease, why they lived above a restaurant instead of in a real house. The boy had learned too young what it felt like to be looked down on, and he hated seeing it happen to others. The men ate slowly, deliberately, drawing out their meal long past the point of courtesy. They sent back the steak twice more, complained about the temperature in the diner, asked for refills of water every 5 minutes. Holly handled it all with exhausted grace, but Gordon could see her breaking. He'd seen that same breaking in his own reflection during those early years. The moment when you realize that no matter how hard you try, some people will never see you as worthy of basic respect. It was a lesson he'd hoped Holly would learn more gently, but life rarely offered gentle lessons to people who started from the bottom. Finally, after nearly 2 hours, the men finished their meal. Holly brought the check, her hand steady despite everything. Gordon watched from the kitchen as she set it down on their table, watched as one of the men picked it up, glanced at it, and then tossed it back down with a laugh. The sound cut through the diner like a knife. Conversations stopped. Silverware clinked against plates and fell silent. Everyone turned to watch as the man leaned back in his seat, arms crossed over his chest, and said something to Holly that made her take a step back. Gordon couldn't hear the words, but he didn't need to. He could see them written in the way Holly's face crumbled, in the way her hands began to shake. She tried again, her voice rising just enough for Gordon to catch fragments. The policy, the payment, please understand. But the men just laughed, all 3 of them now, their voices loud and cruel. One of them said something about service quality, about standards, about how they shouldn't have to pay for an experience that was beneath them. The word beneath hung in the air like poison. Gordon felt something cold and hard settle in his stomach. He'd heard that word before, directed at him, at his choices, at his life. He'd swallowed it down and kept going because he'd had no other choice. But watching these men use it against Holly, against this young woman who was working herself to exhaustion just to keep her child fed, something in him snapped. Holly's voice broke. "Please," she said, loud enough now for the whole diner to hear. "They'll take it out of my paycheck. I can't afford that. My son needs medicine. Please." The last word came out as barely more than a whisper, and Gordon saw tears start to slip down her cheeks. She tried to wipe them away quickly, but it was too late. Everyone had seen. The men saw too, and their laughter grew louder, more vicious. One of them actually mimicked her, his voice high and mocking. My son needs medicine. The cruelty of it, the casual destruction of another person's dignity, hit Gordon like a physical blow. Around the diner, people shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Old Frank started to stand, his face red with anger, but his wife pulled him back down. The Henderson twins looked at each other, a silent conversation passing between them. Mrs. Chen had tears in her own eyes now. No one moved to help. Gordon understood why. These were working people, People who couldn't afford to make enemies, who had their own families to protect, their own bills to pay. Standing up to men in expensive suits meant risking more than just a confrontation. It meant risking your job, your reputation, your place in a social hierarchy that punished those who stepped out of line. Gordon had been on both sides of that equation. He'd been the one too afraid to speak up, and he'd been the one who desperately needed someone to speak for him. He'd learned something crucial in those moments. Silence was safe, but silence was also a choice. And sometimes, the right choice was the one that scared you most. Behind Holly, standing in the doorway between the kitchen and the dining room, Devon had gone very still. The boy's face had lost all color, his eyes locked on the scene unfolding in front of him. Gordon knew what his son was seeing. Not just three men refusing to pay a bill, but something deeper, something that connected to every moment of their lives together. The boy was remembering, Gordon realized with a sharp pain in his chest. Remembering the parents at school who pulled their children away from him because single fathers were different, suspicious, not quite right. Remembering the time someone had called child services because surely a man couldn't properly care for a child alone. Remembering the social worker who'd come to their apartment, looked around at the modest space, and asked Devon if his father ever hurt him, as if poverty and single parenthood automatically meant abuse. The boy had learned too young what it meant to be judged, to be found wanting through no fault of your own. Gordon saw his son's eyes meet his across the diner. In that moment, father and son shared an understanding that needed no words. This was a choice point. This was a moment that would teach Devon something fundamental about how to move through the world. Would he learn that power always wins, that cruelty goes unchallenged, that the only safe response to injustice is to look away? Or would he learn something else, something harder but infinitely more valuable? Gordon had spent 8 years trying to teach his son about dignity, about treating people with respect regardless of their circumstances, about standing up for what was right even when it was difficult. Now, he realized, the real lesson was about to begin, not through words, but through action, not through preaching, but through example. Gordon untied his apron slowly, deliberately. He folded it and set it on the counter, his movements calm despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. He could feel every eye in the diner turning toward him as he stepped out of the kitchen and into the dining room. His work boots made soft thuds against the checkered linoleum floor. He wasn't a large man, wasn't particularly imposing. Years of hard work had made him lean and strong, but there was nothing physically intimidating about him. His hair was graying at the temples. His hands bore the scars and burns of 15 years in a kitchen. His jeans and flannel shirt marked him clearly as working class, but as he walked toward Holly and those 3 men, he carried himself with a quiet certainty that made people stop and pay attention. He stopped directly behind Holly, close enough that she could feel his presence but not touching her. He didn't put a hand on her shoulder, didn't make any gesture that might seem proprietary or controlling. He simply stood there, a silent statement of solidarity, and waited for the men to notice him. It took them a moment. They were still laughing, still playing to their own sense of superiority. When one of them finally looked up and saw Gordon standing there, the laughter died in his throat. The other 2 followed his gaze, and suddenly the atmosphere in the diner shifted again. This wasn't an isolated incident anymore, a lone waitress being harassed by customers. This was something else, something that carried weight and consequence. Gordon didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. When he spoke, his words carried across the silent diner with perfect clarity. "Gentlemen," he said, and there was no anger in his tone, just a bone-deep weariness that somehow made his words more powerful. "Your customers here. I respect that. But Holly is also a person. She deserves your respect too." The simplicity of it hung in the air. The men stared at him, clearly trying to decide how to respond. One of them, the one who'd been doing most of the talking, recovered first. He leaned back in his seat, trying to reassert his dominance through body language. "And you are?" he asked, his voice dripping with condescension. Gordon held his gaze. "I'm the owner. I'm also the one who cooked your food. The steak you sent back 3 times was perfect the first time. The fries you complained about were exactly as you ordered them. The service you received was professional and courteous. The man's face flushed red, but Gordon continued before he could interrupt. If there was genuinely something wrong with your meal, I apologize and I'll gladly refund your money. But we both know that's not what this is about. The words landed like stones in still water, creating ripples that spread through the diner. People were leaning forward now, listening intently. Even Devon had stepped closer, though he stayed near the kitchen doorway. One of the other men spoke up, his voice aggressive. We don't have to pay for service that didn't meet our standards. That's our right as customers. Gordon nodded slowly, as if considering this. You're right, he said. You have standards. We all do. Mine is that everyone who walks through that door gets treated with dignity. Everyone. Regardless of what they're wearing, how much money they have, or what kind of work they do. He paused, and in that pause, something shifted in his expression. Something harder, more personal. 8 years ago, I stood where Holly is standing now. Different diner, different city, but the same situation. I had a 6-month-old baby and a wife who'd just died. I needed work. Any work. I went to every restaurant in town, begging for a chance. The diner was completely silent now. Even the men at the table had stopped smirking, caught despite themselves by the quiet intensity in Gordon's voice. Most places turned me away the moment they saw the baby. Single father, they said. Too much liability, too much drama, not reliable. One manager actually laughed at me, asked if I was planning to change diapers during the dinner rush. I remember standing in his kitchen, my son crying against my chest, and feeling like I was disappearing, like I wasn't even human enough to deserve basic courtesy. He let the words sit for a moment, watching them register on the men's faces. One person didn't turn me away. Guy named Bill Chen. He owned a little diner not much different from this one. He gave me a job washing dishes, let me keep Devon in a carrier while I worked, covered shifts when the baby was sick. He saved my life. Not with grand gestures, just with basic human decency. Gordon looked down at Holly, who was staring up at him with tears streaming down her face. When Holly walked in here 2 weeks ago, I saw the same thing Bill saw in me. Someone trying their best, someone who deserved a chance. She's been working 2 jobs to keep a roof over her son's head. She comes in early, stays late, never complains. She treats every customer with respect, even when they don't return it. His voice grew quieter, but somehow more forceful. Today, she served you for 2 hours. She remade your order multiple times without complaint. She remained professional even when you mocked her. And now you want to walk out without paying. Because in your minds, she doesn't deserve the basic wages she's earned. One of the men started to speak, but Gordon held up a hand. I'm not finished. The authority in those 3 words was absolute. The meal you ate, I prepared it personally. Every steak, every fry, every element of that salad. I've been cooking for 25 years. I used to be head chef at Meridian, the most expensive restaurant in the city. I know what quality food looks like, and what I gave you today was better than most of what I served there. So if you want to claim the food wasn't good enough, you're not just insulting Holly. You're insulting me, my craft, and 15 years of work I've put into this place. But more than that, you're teaching my son something I never want him to learn. Gordon turned slightly, gesturing toward Devon standing in the kitchen doorway. That's my boy. He's 8 years old. He does his homework in that corner booth every day, and he watches everything that happens here, every interaction, every moment. It's all teaching him how the world works. Today, he's watching 3 grown men try to use their money and their suits as permission to be cruel. He's watching you treat another human being like she's worthless, and he's waiting to see what happens next. Will he learn that cruelty wins? That power means you can hurt people without consequences? Or will he learn something else? Gordon's voice broke slightly, the emotion finally showing through. I've spent 8 years teaching him to be kind, to be respectful, to see the value in every person regardless of their job or their bank account. In the next 5 minutes, you're going to teach him whether any of that matters. The silence that followed was crushing. Every person in that diner felt the weight of Gordon's words, understood what was at stake. This wasn't just about a bill anymore. It was about something fundamental, something that cut to the heart of how people treated each other, how society functioned, what values mattered. The three men looked at each other, clearly uncomfortable now, their earlier swagger completely gone. They'd come in here expecting an easy target, a chance to flex their power, maybe a story they could tell their friends later about putting some waitress in her place. Instead, they'd walked into a moment that demanded something from them, something they weren't sure they had to give. The youngest of the three men, the one who'd been mostly silent throughout the meal, reached slowly for his wallet. His hand shook slightly as he pulled out bills, far more than the check required. He set them on the table, his eyes fixed on the money rather than meeting anyone's gaze. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. His voice was so soft that people had to strain to hear it. "I have a daughter. She's 5. He stopped, his jaw working as he tried to find more words. "I wouldn't want anyone to treat her the way we just treated you." He looked up at Holly then, and there were tears in his eyes. "I'm so sorry." The moment hung suspended in time. The other two men sat frozen, watching their companion's unexpected betrayal of their united front. Then, slowly, almost reluctantly, the second man pulled out his wallet as well. He didn't speak, didn't apologize, just added his bills to the pile on the table. But his face had changed. The arrogance was gone, replaced by something that looked like shame. The third man, the one who'd been leading the charge, sat for a long moment without moving. His hands gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles white. When he finally pulled out his wallet, his movements were jerky, angry. He threw bills onto the table, more than the others, as if trying to buy his way out of the guilt settling over him. "We paid," he said, his voice tight. "Can we go now?" Gordon nodded slowly. "You can leave anytime you want. You're not prisoners here." But he paused, and in that pause, something profound passed between him and these three men. "You came in here thinking you knew your worth and everyone else's. You left your office today in your expensive suits, and you saw this place, this diner, these people, as beneath you. You saw Holly as less than human because she serves food for a living. You saw me as someone you could dismiss because I chose family over career advancement. But here's what you didn't see." He gestured around the diner, at the customers sitting in their booths, at the worn but clean floors, at the menu board with its handwritten specials. "This place represents 15 years of me choosing to be present for my son. Every meal cooked here. I cooked it while teaching Devon his letters, his numbers, how to be a good person. Holly's 2 jobs represent her choosing to keep her child safe and fed even when it costs her sleep and health. Everyone in this room is making choices, working hard, trying to build lives worth living. That doesn't make us less than you. It makes us human, just like you." The three men stood awkwardly, not quite sure how to exit gracefully from this situation they'd created. The youngest one paused next to Holly. "I meant what I said," he told her quietly. "I am sorry. I'll do better." Holly nodded, unable to speak, her face still wet with tears. The men walked toward the door, and as they passed Devon, the boy looked up at them with an expression far too old for his 8 years. An expression that said he'd learned something today, something important, but also something sad. The recognition that adults could be cruel, that money and status could twist people into smaller versions of themselves, that his father's lessons about kindness weren't universally shared values but battlefield choices in an often harsh world. The door closed behind them, and for a long moment, nobody moved. Then old Frank started clapping. It was slow, deliberate, the sound of his weathered hands coming together echoing in the quiet diner. One by one, others joined him. The Henderson twins, Mrs. Chen, the young couple in the corner booth, the businessman who came in every Tuesday for lunch. The applause built gradually, not wild or celebratory, but steady and meaningful, an acknowledgement of what they'd witnessed, a statement of solidarity with Gordon and Holly, with the values that had just been defended, with the quiet dignity of working people standing up for each other. Gordon waved his hand, uncomfortable with the attention. "That's enough," he said gently. "Holly needs a break. We all do." He turned to the young waitress, whose shoulders were shaking with suppressed sobs. "Take 15 minutes," he told her. "Go splash water on your face. Sit in the back room. Breathe." Holly nodded and fled toward the kitchen, and Gordon watched her go with understanding in his eyes. He knew that feeling, that overwhelming rush of emotion after a confrontation, the need to be alone while you put yourself back together. He'd give her the time and space she needed, and when she came back, he'd make sure she knew that nothing about this was her fault. The diner slowly returned to its normal rhythm. People went back to their meals, their conversations, though the energy had changed. There was a warmth now, a sense of shared experience that bound everyone together. Gordon returned to the kitchen and started working on the backed-up orders, his hands moving through familiar motions while his mind processed what had just happened. He heard small footsteps behind him and turned to find Devon standing there, looking up at him with serious eyes. "Did you mean all that stuff you said?" the boy asked. "About teaching me and about doing the right thing?" Gordon knelt down so he was at eye level with his son. "Every word," he said. "I meant every word." Devon was quiet for a moment, thinking. Those men were mean to Miss Holly. Gordon nodded. They were. "But did you see what happened at the end?" The boy's face scrunched up in concentration. One of them said, "Sorry." He cried a little bit. Gordon felt his throat tighten. "That's right. He did." "Do you know what that means?" Devon shook his head. "It means that sometimes people do bad things, but that doesn't mean they're bad forever. Sometimes they just need someone to remind them how to be good, how to see other people as real. That man has a daughter he loves. When I talked about you watching, when I reminded him that children learn from what we do, something in him remembered that he wants to be a good example for his child. Just like I want to be a good example for you." "But the other men didn't say sorry," Devon pointed out, his child's sense of justice demanding acknowledgement of this fact. Gordon smiled sadly. "No, they didn't. Not with words. But they paid, and they left. Sometimes that's the best you can hope for. Not everyone is ready to change. Not everyone is willing to admit when they're wrong. But you don't stand up for what's right because you think it'll change everyone. You do it because it's right, because someone needs defending, and because staying silent makes you part of the problem." He pulled his son into a hug, breathing in the smell of kid shampoo and pencil shavings. "I never want you to be silent when you see someone being hurt, even if you're scared, even if it costs you something. Because your voice, your action, it might be the only thing standing between someone and despair." They held each other for a long moment, and then Devon pulled back. "I'm proud of you, Ba," he said seriously, using the nickname he'd given Gordon when he first learned to talk. "You were brave." Gordon felt tears prick his own eyes now. "I'm proud of you too, buddy. For watching, for learning, for having a good heart." They stood together in the kitchen, father and son, two people who'd built a life from ruins and refused to let the world's harshness destroy their capacity for kindness. Outside, the lunch rush was winding down. Inside, something had shifted. Something important and lasting. Holly emerged from the back room 20 minutes later, her face washed, her composure restored. Gordon caught her eye and gestured her over. "You okay?" he asked. She nodded, then shook her head, then laughed shakily. "I don't know. That was intense." Gordon poured her a cup of coffee and pushed it across the counter. "The good news is, you handled it perfectly. You stayed professional. You kept trying to resolve it peacefully. You didn't do anything wrong." Holly wrapped her hands around the warm mug. "I was so scared. Not just of losing the money, but of losing this job, of you thinking I'd caused trouble or couldn't handle difficult customers." Gordon's expression softened. "Holly, look at me." She did. "In the 2 weeks you've been here, you've been nothing but excellent. Professional, kind, hard-working. What happened today wasn't about your performance. It was about them choosing to be cruel. And you know what? You kept your dignity through all of it. That matters more than anything else." The afternoon shift continued, and gradually the story of what had happened spread beyond the diner's walls. By closing time, Several people had stopped by who weren't even customers, just neighbors who'd heard about the incident and wanted to offer support. Old Frank's wife came in with a homemade pie for Gordon and Holly to share. The Henderson twins' mother, a formidable woman Gordon had met only a handful of times, showed up to tell Holly that any single mother who worked that hard deserved respect and solidarity. Mrs. Chen brought by a bag of her grandson's outgrown clothes, sized perfectly for Holly's son. These small acts of kindness, these gestures of community support, felt more significant than any grand gesture could have. They were proof that Gordon's earlier words weren't just rhetoric. People did care. They did see each other as human. They did stand together when it mattered. As Gordon locked up that night, Devon asleep on his shoulder and the day's receipts counted and stored, he paused to look around the empty diner. The vinyl booths were worn but clean. The checkered floor showed its age but gleamed from regular mopping. The menu board still bore the same items it had for 15 years, simple food made with care. This place would never make him rich. It would never impress the colleagues from his old life, the ones who'd pitied him when he gave up his prestigious position to become a single father running a small diner. But standing there in the dim light, his son's weight warm against his chest, Gordon felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Pride. Not the ego-driven pride of achievement or status, but the deeper pride that came from knowing you'd lived according to your values, that you'd stood up when it mattered, that you'd built something worth building. The next morning started like any other. Gordon unlocked the door at 5:30, started the coffee, began prepping for breakfast. Devon set up his schoolwork in the corner booth. Holly arrived right on time, her smile genuine now, the fear in her eyes replaced with something steadier. The regulars filtered in, and there was a warmth in their greetings that felt earned, felt real. Around 8:30, the door opened, and Gordon looked up from the griddle to see a familiar figure standing in the entrance. It was the youngest of the three men from yesterday, the one who'd apologized. He stood uncertainly, as if not sure he'd be welcome. Gordon wiped his hands on his apron and walked out to meet him. The diner had gone quiet again, everyone watching. The man shifted his weight nervously. "I know I have no right to come back here," he said, "but I wanted to give you this." He held out an envelope. Gordon took it, opened it. Inside was a check made out to Holly for $500. There was also a handwritten note. The man cleared his throat. "I couldn't sleep last night. I kept thinking about what you said, about children watching and learning, about the example I'm setting. I went home and looked at my daughter, and I felt sick." He paused, his voice rough with emotion. "I've been so focused on climbing, on achieving, on being successful, that I forgot the basics. Treat people with respect. See their humanity. Don't confuse your net worth with your self-worth. I don't expect you to forgive me. I just wanted you to know that I heard you, and I'm going to try to do better." Gordon looked at the check, then at the man's face. He saw genuine remorse there, genuine desire to change. He thought about Bill Chen, the man who'd given him a chance all those years ago, who'd seen past the circumstances to the person underneath. He thought about second chances, about how everyone deserved them, how growth only happened when people were allowed to try again. He handed the check back. "Keep your money," Gordon said gently. The man's face fell, but Gordon continued. "But if you're serious about doing better, I have a different suggestion." The man looked up, hopeful and confused. "There's a women's shelter 2 blocks from here. They're always looking for donations, for people willing to help single mothers get back on their feet. Give this to them. Better yet, volunteer there. See what it's really like for people who are trying to build lives from nothing. Learn their names, their stories. Let it change you." The man stared at Gordon for a long moment, then slowly nodded. "I'll do that," he said. "I will." He held out his hand, and Gordon shook it. "Thank you," the man said. "For yesterday, for today, for not giving up on people." Gordon smiled. "I had someone who didn't give up on me, just paying it forward." The man turned to leave, then paused. "Can I ask you something?" Gordon nodded. "Why did you give up being a head chef? You clearly had talent, success. Why walk away from all that? Gordon glanced over at Devon, who was watching them with curious eyes. Because some things matter more than success, he said simply. Some things matter more than anything. The man left, and the diner slowly returned to its morning rhythm. Holly came up to Gordon during a lull, tears in her eyes again, but happy tears this time. Did you really just turn down $500? She asked. Gordon shrugged. You earned your wages yesterday. Anything beyond that would have felt like charity, and neither of us needs anyone's pity. We just need respect and fair pay for honest work. Holly shook her head in wonder. I've never met anyone like you. Gordon laughed. I'm not special, Holly. I'm just someone who's been where you are and who had help when I needed it. That's all any of us can do. Help each other. Stand up for each other. Remember that everyone's fighting battles we can't see. The weeks that followed brought small changes and quiet victories. Holly grew more confident in her work, her smile reaching her eyes more often. She mentioned in passing that her son's health had improved, that she'd been able to afford better medicine, that things were looking up. Devon came home from school one day and told Gordon about standing up for a kid who was being bullied, about how he'd remembered what his father had done in the diner and found the courage to use his voice. The regular customers seemed more patient, more kind, more likely to see the person behind the service. And Gordon continued doing what he'd always done, cooking meals and raising his son and trying to build a small corner of the world where dignity was the baseline, not the exception. On a quiet Tuesday afternoon 3 months later, Gordon looked up from the grill to see Bill Chen standing in the doorway. The old man was grayer now, more stooped, but his eyes were the same, sharp, kind, seeing everything. Gordon's breath caught in his throat. He hadn't seen his old mentor in nearly 5 years, not since Bill had retired and moved to be closer to his daughter. Bill, he managed. What are you doing here? The old man shuffled in, looking around the diner with approval. Heard a story about you, Bill said in his gruff way. About 3 businessmen and a lesson in humanity. Wanted to see if it was true. Wanted to see how my investment turned out. Gordon came around the counter and embraced the old man carefully, mindful of his fragility. Bill patted his back. You did good, kid, he said quietly. Better than good. You took what I gave you and multiplied it. Gordon pulled back, his eyes stinging. I was just trying to be like you. Bill shook his head. No, you became better than me. I gave you a job. You built a community. You taught your son. You changed lives. That's not copying. That's transcending. They sat together in the corner booth, and Gordon introduced Bill to Devon, explained that this was the man who'd saved them both all those years ago. The boy's eyes went wide with understanding, with recognition of how intertwined their lives were with this stranger's single act of kindness. Bill stayed for lunch, ate Gordon's food with appreciative noises, talked with the regulars, observed the easy warmth that permeated the space. Before he left, he pulled Gordon aside. You know what the difference is between a good restaurant and a great one? Gordon shook his head. A good restaurant serves good food. A great restaurant serves humanity. It reminds people what it means to be human, to be seen, to matter. He gestured around the diner. This is a great restaurant, Gordon. Not because of the food, though that's excellent, but because of what happens here. The way you treat people, the way they treat each other, the values you're teaching your son and everyone who walks through that door. This is what I hoped for when I hired you. This is why I took that chance, because I saw in you what you now see in Holly and everyone else you give opportunities to. The capacity for kindness, the refusal to let circumstances destroy compassion. Gordon walked Bill out to his car, the old man's hand firm on his shoulder. Before Bill drove away, he said one more thing. When I gave you that job, I told you I was giving you a chance to prove yourself. But I was wrong. You didn't need to prove anything. You were already worthy. You just needed someone to see it. Gordon has carried those words with him for the rest of his life. They became part of the foundation he built his world on, part of the message he passed to his son and to every person who worked for him. You are worthy, not because of what you achieve or how much you earn or what status you hold, but because you're human, because you exist, because dignity is a birthright, not something that has to be earned. Years later, when Devon was grown and building his own life, he would come back to the diner and work shifts with his father. They'd move through the kitchen in synchronized rhythm, 25 years of shared history in every movement. And sometimes, when a customer was rude or dismissive, when someone forgot that the people serving them were human beings deserving of respect, Devon would watch his father handle it with the same quiet authority he'd learned all those years ago. Not with anger, but with firm insistence on dignity. Not with violence, but with the revolutionary act of seeing people, really seeing them, and refusing to participate in their diminishment. The diner became something of a local legend, not because of any dramatic events, but because of the accumulation of small kindnesses, of dignity defended, of community built meal by meal, shift by shift, choice by choice. People brought their children there not just for the food, but for the education, to learn what it looked like when someone stood up for what was right, to see working people treated with respect, to understand that status and wealth had nothing to do with worth, that the measure of a person was found in how they treated those who could do nothing for them in return. And on the wall near the kitchen, visible to everyone who worked there, Gordon hung a small plaque. It bore no fancy inscription, just a simple statement that Bill had once said to him: "Everyone deserves a chance. Everyone deserves dignity. No exceptions." Staff members would see it hundreds of times a day. So often it became part of the background. But every so often, when they needed it most, those words would come back into focus. A reminder of what they were building here. A reminder that their work mattered not because of what they served, but because of how they served. With respect, with kindness, with the unshakable belief that every person who walked through that door was worthy of being seen, heard, and treated with the full dignity of their humanity. The three businessmen never came back to the diner, but Gordon heard through the neighborhood grapevine that the youngest one had indeed started volunteering at the women's shelter, that he'd donated not just money but time, that he'd changed how he treated service workers, that he'd told his colleagues the story of the day he'd learned what real wealth looked like. The story spread, mutated, grew in the telling, but at its core, it remained the same. A simple tale of people choosing kindness over cruelty, dignity over degradation, community over contempt. A reminder that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is stand behind someone who needs defending and refuse to move. Gordon never sought recognition for what he'd done. He didn't share the story on social media or seek media attention. He simply continued showing up every morning at 5:30, unlocking the doors, making coffee, preparing food, and treating every person who entered his establishment as if they mattered. Because they did, every single one of them. The businessman in the expensive suit and the homeless veteran who sometimes came in for a cup of coffee they could barely afford. The prom couples celebrating and the elderly widow eating alone. The construction workers on lunch break and the single mothers grabbing a quick meal between shifts. All of them were welcomed with the same warmth, the same respect, the same recognition of their fundamental humanity. This was Gordon's legacy, though he never thought of it in those terms. Not wealth or status or professional accolades, but a small diner where people were treated right, where children learned what justice looked like in action, where the weary could find not just food but dignity, where the lesson was taught daily through deed rather than word, that every person you meet is carrying battles you know nothing about, that kindness costs nothing but means everything, that standing up for others is never wrong, even when it's hard, even when it's scary, even when the outcome is uncertain. And on quiet mornings, when the diner was empty and the coffee was brewing and the sun was just starting to paint the sky with color, Gordon would stand in his kitchen and feel the weight of all those choices, all those moments, all those people whose lives had intersected with his in this small space. He would think about the scared young man he'd been, holding a newborn and wondering how he'd survive. He would think about Bill Chen's steady hand on his shoulder, the first person to see past his circumstances to his potential. He would think about Holly and all the others he'd given chances to, watching them grow and thrive. He would think about his son, now grown but still coming back to this place that had shaped him, still carrying forward the lessons learned in this worn but beloved space. And Gordon would smile, not with pride but with gratitude. Gratitude that he'd been given a chance when he needed one. Gratitude that he'd been able to pass that chance forward. Gratitude for the community that had formed around this simple place. This ordinary diner, this revolutionary space where the radical act of treating people with dignity had created ripples that spread farther than he'd ever know. The bills on that table had been paid, but the real payment, the real settling of accounts, happened in these quiet moments, in the lives changed, the lessons learned, the dignity defended, the humanity recognized. Sometimes the quietest voices do carry the heaviest truth, and sometimes that truth is simply this: we are all worthy, we are all deserving of respect, we are all fighting battles others cannot see. And when we choose to stand up for each other, to defend each other's dignity, to see each other's humanity, we create something that transcends any individual moment. We create hope, we create community, we create the world we want to live in. One small choice at a time, one defended dignity at a time, one act of courage at a time. That was the lesson Gordon had learned, and taught, and lived every single day. And in the end, it was enough. More than enough. It was everything.